November 3, 1917. Passchendaele Ridge, Flanders, Belgium. The fog rolled across no man's land like a living thing, thick as wool, cold as death, transforming the Western Front into a ghost world where visibility measured in arm's lengths. Sergeant Thomas Ridgway of the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, lay motionless in a shell crater half filled with freezing water, his body covered in mud that had long since stopped feeling cold. Cradled in his arms was a weapon that officially did not exist, a prototype rifle designated P-14 Mekorwarn T, fitted with an experimental Aldis telescopic sight and chambered for the .303 British cartridge, modified with a sound moderator that reduced muzzle report to a whisper in the artillery thunder. Only 12 of these rifles had been manufactured, distributed to selected marksmen with orders to field test them under combat conditions, and more importantly, to never let them fall into German hands. The weapon transformed fog from obstacle into ally, turning the perpetual mist of Flanders from tactical nightmare into hunting ground. In the 72 hours since receiving this rifle, Ridgway had killed 19 German officers, 14 of them while they believed themselves safely behind their own lines, invisible in the fog, protected by distance and weather. They were wrong about all three assumptions. The Great War had entered its 4th year, and both sides faced a crisis of morale rooted in mathematics, the ratio of casualties between officers and enlisted men. German army doctrine relied heavily on Führerprinzip, leadership principle, where junior officers led from the front, made tactical decisions independently, and embodied Prussian military culture. Kill enough German officers and entire companies became rudderless, hesitant, vulnerable. British High Command understood this intellectually, but implementing it was another matter entirely. Standard infantry rifles, the Lee Enfield No. On May 3rd, were excellent weapons for trench warfare, reliable and fast-firing, but they lacked the precision and range required for selective targeting. Snipers using modified service rifles could engage targets at 400-600 yards under ideal conditions, but ideal conditions on the Western Front existed only in training manuals. The reality was mud, rain, fog, smoke from constant artillery, and atmosphere so saturated with moisture that optical sights fogged within minutes of exposure. The P-14 MKT prototype emerged from a collaboration between the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield and a civilian optical engineer named Frederick Aldis, who had been experimenting with sealed telescopic sights for maritime use. The genius was not in magnification. The Aldis sight offered only 3x magnification, less than German scopes, but in fog penetration. Aldis had developed a lens coating derived from analyzing how lighthouse beacons remained visible through heavy sea fog. The coating, combined with a specific focal length and internal prism design, allowed the sight to gather and concentrate ambient light in ways that defeated atmospheric interference. The rifle itself was a precision instrument, match-grade barrel, hand-fitted action, adjustable trigger pull reduced to 3 pounds, and, most controversially, a cylindrical sound moderator that British ordnance officers initially refused to authorize because it looked too much like something from a spy novel. But field reports from the Somme had been unequivocal. German counter-sniper doctrine relied on muzzle flash detection and sound triangulation. Eliminate both, and the enemy couldn't locate you even if they knew you were there. The 12 P-14 Mekorwarn rifles were issued in October 1917 to marksmen selected not for shooting scores, but for psychological profile, men who could kill methodically, repeatedly, without the emotional release of visible combat. Men who could lie in freezing water for 16 hours waiting for a single shot. Men who understood that war at this level was not battle, but applied murder. Thomas Ridgway had been a gamekeeper before the war, employed on a Scottish estate where his job involved culling deer populations and eliminating poachers who hunted the laird's grouse. He was 31 years old, too old for the enthusiastic patriotism that had driven younger men to recruitment offices in 1914, and he'd enlisted not from ideology, but from economic necessity. The estate had closed when the laird's 3 sons all died at Ypres within the same week. The army had initially assigned him to standard infantry, where his age and rural background made him an outsider among city boys who sang music hall songs and talked about football. But a training officer noticed that Ridgway could judge distance without instruments, could read wind from watching grass movement, and most tellingly, showed no emotional reaction when firing at human-shaped targets. The officer recommended him for scout sniper training, and Ridgway discovered he possessed a talent that peacetime had never required, the ability to disconnect empathy from necessity, to see human beings as simply targets requiring specific sight pictures and trigger press techniques. When he received the P-14 MKI-T, he spent 2 days simply learning the weapon, not its mechanics, which were straightforward, but its personality. Every precision rifle has idiosyncrasies, how it responds to temperature changes, where the first cold-bore shot impacts versus subsequent shots, how the moderator affects barrel harmonics. Ridgway test-fired 60 rounds at various ranges, in different weather conditions, building an internal database of ballistic data that no manual could provide. The Aldi sight revealed something unexpected. In heavy fog, the human eye becomes almost useless beyond 50 yards, but the scope could resolve shapes and movement out to 400 yards by gathering scattered light that normal vision couldn't process. It was like having an unfair advantage written into physics itself. On November 1st, Ridgway took his first shot with the new rifle. A German lieutenant coordinating wire repair parties 300 yards behind the German front line, visible only as a darker shadow in the fog, distinguished from enlisted men only by the map case he carried and the way other soldiers oriented toward him when receiving orders. Ridgway exhaled, squeezed, and watched through the scope as the officer collapsed forward into the mud. The surrounding Germans looked around in confusion, searching for a sniper position that was 300 yards away in fog thick enough to hide a cathedral. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. No muzzle flash, no sharp report, just a man who had been alive and was now dead for reasons they couldn't determine. By November 2nd, German commanders in the Passchendaele sector began receiving troubling reports. Officers were dying in circumstances that violated understanding of sniper warfare. Snipers required line of sight, clear weather, and proximity to no man's land. These deaths occurred in heavy fog, deep behind German lines with no evidence of enemy presence. A German captain wrote in his diary, "3 of my officers dead in 2 days, all shot through the head or upper chest, all in conditions where British snipers should be blind and deaf. The men are beginning to whisper about Nebelgespenst, the fog ghost." The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German officers who had cultivated an image of fearless leadership began exhibiting caution that bordered on paranoia. They stopped moving openly behind their own lines, conducted briefings in covered positions, and most significantly, became less visible to their own men, which degraded the very leadership presence that made them effective. Ridgway, meanwhile, had developed a methodology that transformed fog from obstacle into weapon system. Each morning, he would infiltrate no man's land before dawn, not to the British front line, but to shell craters and collapse trenches in the neutral zone itself, positions that German doctrine assumed were uninhabitable. He would settle into these positions with the patience of a professional hunter, covering himself with mud and debris until he was indistinguishable from the landscape, and simply wait. The P-14 sound moderator meant he didn't need to worry about acoustic detection, and the Aldi sight meant he could see targets that couldn't see him. But the real innovation was psychological. He never shot immediately. He would observe German positions for hours, identifying officers not by uniform, which was often concealed by greatcoats, but by behavior. Officers consulted maps, gave orders, moved with purpose while enlisted men moved with routine. Once identified, Ridgway would wait until the officer was engaged in command activities, coordinating artillery, directing trench repairs, conducting briefings, moments when the officer's authority was most visible to his men. Then a single shot, and the authority figure would simply cease to exist. The effect on German morale was insidious. It created the impression that leadership itself was fatal, that rising to responsibility meant painting a target on your chest that could be struck from nowhere by an enemy who could see through fog and kill from impossible distances. The German response escalated systematically. First came counter-sniper teams, pairs of experienced marksmen equipped with high magnification scopes, assigned to observe British lines and neutralize the fog ghost. They saw nothing because Ridgway operated from no man's land itself, not from British positions. Then came aggressive patrolling, infantry squads sent into the fog to physically sweep the neutral zone and locate sniper hides. They found several prepared positions, but all were empty, abandoned, or never occupied. Ridgway never used the same position twice, and he had an uncanny ability to sense when German patrols were approaching, withdrawing hours before they arrived. The Germans tried illumination rounds, Flares fired into the fog, hoping to create enough light for visual detection. But the Passchendaele fog was so dense that flares merely created diffuse glow without revealing details, like trying to light a room filled with milk. Most desperately, German artillery began firing into no man's land at random intervals, hoping to kill the sniper through statistical probability. They succeeded only in making the landscape even more cratered and treacherous, which gave Ridgway more positions to hide in. By November 4th, 19 German officers were dead, and the German command structure in the Passchendaele sector was unraveling. Lieutenants refused battlefield promotions because it meant assuming the cursed visibility of command. Captains conducted briefings by written note rather than verbal order to avoid standing upright. A German major requested transfer to the Eastern Front, stating in his official request, "I would rather face Russian artillery than this invisible demon." British intelligence intercepted this communication and distributed it throughout the Western Front as proof that selective targeting was achieving strategic effects beyond simple casualty numbers. But what the intelligence reports didn't capture was the psychological cost to Ridgway himself. He had killed 19 men in conditions where they never saw him, never had a chance to fight back, never knew they were in danger until the moment they ceased to exist. Gamekeeper work had prepared him for solitary killing, but deer don't have families who write letters, don't have subordinates who watch them die, don't represent anything beyond themselves. Each German officer he killed was a son, a brother, a father, a man who had studied tactics and military history and believed his training would keep him safe. Ridgway was discovering that being exceptionally good at killing did not make killing feel any less like murder. It just made the murder more efficient. November 5th brought an unexpected complication. British High Command took notice. A staff officer arrived at Ridgway's battalion with orders to interview him about tactics and effectiveness of the P-14 Memkernity. The interview revealed a disconnect between how headquarters imagined this weapon being used and how Ridgway actually employed it. The staff officer expected tales of long-range marksmanship, technical discussions about ballistics and optics. Instead, Ridgway described something closer to hunting methodology, studying animal behavior, understanding territorial patterns, exploiting environmental conditions. "You're killing officers as a psychological operation," the staff officer said, finally understanding. "Precisely," Ridgway replied. "Dead Germans are common. Dead German leaders create organizational damage that cascades." The staff officer made notes, clearly pleased, clearly missing the haunted quality in Ridgway's voice that suggested this efficiency came with costs that couldn't be quantified in after-action reports. British High Command wanted to expand the program, manufacture 50 more P-14 MKIT rifles, train 50 more snipers in Ridgway's methods, systematically decapitate German command structure across the entire Western Front. It was brilliant strategy. It was also murder industrialized, the transformation of individual killing into assembly line production, and Ridgway recognized it as the moment when war stopped being about survival and became about bureaucratic optimization of death. He was saved from this fate by the Germans themselves, who finally deployed an effective countermeasure. They stopped sending officers forward. German companies began operating with decentralized command, using NCOs to relay orders, conducting all officer-level decision-making from deep rear positions beyond even the P-14's extended range. It was an admission of defeat wrapped in tactical adaptation. The fog ghost had won so completely that the Germans restructured their entire command doctrine to avoid him. But it also meant Ridgway's mission was over. The weapon had been effective precisely because German officers believed themselves safe. Once they changed that belief, the advantage evaporated. On November 7th, Ridgway was pulled from the front line, debriefed extensively, and informed that the P-14 MKYT program was being recalibrated for different tactical applications. In practice, this meant the remaining 11 rifles would be stored in armories, their existence classified, their capabilities deemed too psychologically damaging to enemy morale to risk wider deployment, because international law didn't prohibit effective weapons. But there were unwritten rules about weapons that made warfare feel less like warfare and more like assassination. Ridgway spent 2 weeks at a casualty clearing station, officially diagnosed with exhaustion and trench fever, but the medical officer's notes mentioned 1,000-yard stare and emotional affect, inconsistent with stated symptoms. He wasn't physically injured. He was psychologically displaced, existing in that liminal space between soldier and something else, between justified military action and serial killing with government authorization. The other wounded men at the clearing station had visible injuries, missing limbs, shrapnel wounds, chemical burns, injuries that proved they'd been in honest combat, that they'd faced an enemy who could fight back. Ridgway had no such proof. His body was intact, his hands steady, his record unblemished. He'd simply killed 19 men who never saw him coming, and now he had to integrate that into an identity that still functioned in peacetime society. A chaplain tried to counsel him, offering the usual reassurances. He'd been a soldier doing his duty. The Germans were the enemy. All killing in war was equally justified by the cause. Ridgway listened politely and said nothing, because the chaplain's framework assumed all combat was equivalent, that shooting a man charging your trench was morally identical to shooting a man reading a letter from his wife 300 yards away in heavy fog. Ridgway knew better. Intent mattered. Awareness mattered. The opportunity to fight back mattered. He had violated something fundamental about human conflict, the implicit contract that says if you're going to kill me, I should at least know you're trying. On November 21st, Ridgway was declared fit for duty and returned to his battalion, but the P-14 Mech-1T was gone, reclaimed by ordnance officers and replaced with a standard Lee Enfield. He was assigned to regular infantry duties, trench rotation, patrol work, the democratic misery shared by all soldiers in the line. It should have felt like a demotion. Instead, it felt like pardon. He could shoot at Germans who were shooting at him, kill men who were actively trying to kill him, participate in violence that was mutual and therefore somehow more honest. The fog still rolled across no man's land most mornings, but now Ridgway was just another soldier, cursing it for making artillery spotting impossible, not using it as camouflage for long-range murder. The psychological relief was immediate and profound. He was visible again, vulnerable again, part of the collective experience of warfare rather than a ghost operating outside its normal rules. December 1917 brought the Battle of Cambrai, the first major tank offensive, a radical departure from trench warfare that promised breakthrough and maneuver. Ridgway's battalion participated in the initial assault, and for the first time since receiving the P-14 weeks earlier, he experienced combat that felt like war instead of execution. Tanks rolled forward. Infantry advanced behind them. Germans fought back with machine guns and artillery, and everyone was equally visible, equally vulnerable, equally engaged in mutual violence. Men died, but they died knowing why, seeing who killed them, participating in an exchange rather than being eliminated from outside the game. It was brutal and honest, and Ridgway found unexpected comfort in its fairness. But British High Command hadn't forgotten about the fog ghost's effectiveness. In mid-December, a different staff officer appeared with a different proposal. Would Ridgway be willing to train other snipers in his fog penetration techniques? Not to create more fog ghosts, the P-14 Mech-IT program remained classified, but to teach general principles of patient observation, behavioral targeting, and environmental exploitation. It was a reasonable request. It was also a test. Could Ridgway's methods be systematized, turned into doctrine, distributed across the Army as standardized practice? The answer, after 2 weeks of trying, was no. What Ridgway did wasn't primarily about marksmanship or even tactics. It was about a specific psychological state that allowed prolonged isolation in no man's land, while maintaining inhuman patience and absolute emotional control. You could teach shooting. You could teach fieldcraft. You couldn't teach the ability to lie motionless in freezing water for 16 hours while watching men go about daily routines, identifying which ones were officers, waiting for the perfect moment, then killing them, and feeling nothing except satisfaction at a clean shot. That required something that existed before training, something that military service revealed but didn't create. The training program was quietly discontinued, and Ridgway returned to regular sniper duties, counter-sniper work, observation post duty, occasional long-range shots at opportunity targets. It was competent, professional, and utterly conventional. The British Army officially recorded that the P-14 Mech-IT had been field-tested with mixed results and not recommended for general issue due to maintenance complications and limited tactical utility. This was a lie. The truth was that the weapon worked too well, revealed uncomfortable questions about where military necessity ended and murder began, and created psychological burdens that no command structure knew how to address. January 1918. The Western Front entered its fourth winter. and both armies settled into the rhythm of attritional stalemate. Ridgway, now recognized as one of the battalion's most experienced snipers, worked in two-man teams conducting counter-sniper operations and intelligence gathering. His partner was a 19-year-old Londoner named Davies who talked constantly, told elaborate lies about his romantic conquests, and possessed the useful quality of being utterly untroubled by the moral complexities of killing. Davies saw Germans as targets, war as a job, and survival as the only meaningful objective. His uncomplicated worldview was both frustrating and oddly therapeutic. Around Davies, Ridgway couldn't retreat into philosophical contemplation because Davies would just make a crude joke and move on. They were positioned in an observation post overlooking a German communication trench when Davies spotted something unusual. A German soldier moving along the trench alone, carrying what appeared to be a rifle case. "Sniper going to position," Davies whispered. "Want to take him?" Ridgway observed through his scope. Standard Lee Enfield now. No experimental optics. No sound moderator. The German was young, moved carefully, paused to check sight lines. Professional. Competent. Doing exactly what Ridgway had done hundreds of times. "No," Ridgway said. "Why not? Clean shot? Easy. He's doing his job. We're doing ours. If he shoots at us, we shoot back. But I'm not killing him for existing." Davies looked at Ridgway with the confused expression of someone confronting an inexplicable policy change. "Since when do we care about fair play with Germans?" "Since always. We just forgot for a while." It was a lie. Davies had never forgotten because Davies had never thought about it, but Ridgway needed to believe that this new restraint was recovery of original principles, rather than admission that the fog ghost weeks had damaged something fundamental in his moral architecture. They watched the German sniper settle into position 400 yards away, clearly establishing an overwatch of British lines. He was good, barely visible, disciplined, patient. Under other circumstances, Ridgway would have respected the craftsmanship. Under these specific circumstances, he and Davies simply withdrew from their observation post and relocated to a different sector, leaving the German sniper to watch an area the British no longer occupied. "That's not how this works," Davies protested. "That's exactly how this works," Ridgway replied. "He controls that ground. We control different ground. Everyone lives." March 1918 brought the Kaiserschlacht, the German Empire's final desperate offensive, throwing everything into one massive assault before American forces could arrive in decisive numbers. The Western Front exploded into mobile warfare as German stormtroopers broke through Allied lines using infiltration tactics and overwhelming artillery preparation. Ridgway's battalion was caught in the retreat, falling back through the same terrain they'd fought over for months, destroying supply dumps, conducting rearguard actions, buying time with casualties. It was chaos, confusion, and something paradoxically close to relief. This was honest warfare again. Both sides visible, both sides moving, both sides equally desperate and afraid. During the retreat, Ridgway's unit became separated from the main British line, a 30-man group trapped behind advancing German forces, forced to hide in a collapsed farmhouse, while German columns passed within meters of their position. They had perhaps 4 hours before systematic German patrols would discover them, and no realistic hope of fighting through to friendly lines. The ranking sergeant, a veteran named Morrison who'd survived since 1914, asked Ridgway, "You were the fog ghost, weren't you? The sniper who was killing German officers in fog?" Ridgway didn't answer, which was answer enough. Morrison continued, "Could you do that now? Kill enough of them to create confusion, give us a chance to slip through?" Technically, yes. Ridgway still had his rifle, still had his skills, still understood how to identify targets and exploit environmental conditions. The German columns were moving openly, officers visible and confident, believing themselves safely behind their own advancing lines, exactly the circumstances that had made the fog ghost effective. One man with a rifle and patience could kill a dozen Germans in 30 minutes, create panic and disorganization, turn a confident advance into cautious defense. But Ridgway had promised himself, silently, privately, in the space between December and March, that he was done with that kind of killing, done with the invisible murder that turned war into something that felt like serial killing with patriotic justification. "No," he said to Morrison. "Then we'll have to fight our way out," Morrison replied, accepting the answer without argument, recognizing that whatever had broken in Ridgway was beyond military discipline to repair. They attacked at dusk, 30 desperate men charging into superior German forces with no plan beyond chaos and movement. Half of them died in the first 2 minutes. Ridgway was not among them, which felt less like fortune and more like cosmic irony. The breakout was successful only in the technical sense that 15 men survived and reached British lines. Ridgway took 2 bullets, one through his left shoulder, one grazing his skull, and woke 3 days later in a field hospital with a doctor explaining that he was exceptionally lucky and profoundly stupid for charging machine gun positions when he could have done that sniper thing the rumors talk about. The rumors had spread, apparently. The fog ghost had become legend, grown in the telling, transformed from one man with an experimental rifle into a supernatural force that could see through fog and kill from impossible distances. Other snipers claimed credit for his kills. German propaganda warned about British naval Gespenst units, plural now, an entire organization rather than a single sniper. The truth was classified, but the myth was common knowledge, and Ridgway found himself in the strange position of being famous for something he'd done but couldn't acknowledge. Celebrated for effectiveness, he found morally devastating. While recovering, he received a letter from Frederick Aldous, the optical engineer who designed the scope system. Aldous had heard about the P-14 Mecha-YT program's termination and wanted to explain his intentions. I designed the fog penetration optics for search and rescue applications, lighthouse keepers spotting vessels in distress, maritime navigation in hazardous conditions. When the War Office requested military applications, I believed I was helping save British soldiers by giving them technical superiority. I did not anticipate that superior vision in fog would be used primarily for. The letter stopped mid-sentence, crossed out, then continued. I wanted to help people see better. I did not want to help people kill better. This distinction should have been obvious, but technical problems are seductive because they have technical solutions, and technical solutions feel morally neutral. They are not neutral. I am sorry for my contribution to your burden. Ridgway kept the letter, read it multiple times, found strange comfort in knowing that the weapon's creator also felt complicit in transformations neither of them had intended. Technology doesn't care about intention. It only cares about capability. The P-14 MET was capable of making fog into a weapon, of turning weather into tactical advantage, of allowing skilled snipers to kill men who believed themselves invisible and safe. That capability existed now, independent of whether anyone used it. A permanent addition to humanity's catalog of ways to kill each other more efficiently. By May 1918, Ridgway was physically recovered but officially classified as wounded and evacuated. Military bureaucracy's way of acknowledging that some soldiers break in ways that don't heal with rest and rations. He was assigned to a training depot in southern England, teaching basic marksmanship to new recruits, most of whom were 18 years old and enthusiastic about finally getting to do their bit. They asked him about combat, about killing Germans, about what it felt like to be a real soldier. He told them about trench foot, about the smell of latrines, about how cold rain made rifles malfunction. He did not tell them about the fog ghost, about 19 German officers who died without ever knowing they'd been targeted, about what it felt like to be exceptionally good at a form of killing that looked nothing like the warfare they imagined. One recruit, a boy from Manchester with chronic acne and a stutter, asked the question Ridgway had been dreading. Sir, did you ever kill anyone? Technically, the answer was yes. Officially confirmed, kills numbered in the dozens between conventional sniper work in the fog ghost weeks and desperate firefights during the March retreat. But the question beneath the question was, what does it feel like? Does it change you? Am I about to become someone I don't recognize? Yes, Ridgway answered. And here's what no one tells you. The killing isn't the hard part. Shooting is just mechanical. Sight picture, trigger press, follow through. The hard part comes after, when you realize that the man you killed was exactly like you, scared, doing what he was told, trying to survive. The hard part is living with the fact that you're good at something that should be difficult. The recruit looked disappointed, as if he'd expected tales of heroism and glory. The other instructors looked uncomfortable, as if Ridgway had violated an unspoken rule about maintaining useful illusions. But honesty was the only gift Ridgway had left to give. The knowledge that war transforms people in ways that don't reverse when the fighting stops. That skills learned in combat don't translate to peacetime, and that being an efficient killer is a qualification that civilian society has no use for. The armistice came in November 1918, and Ridgway returned to Scotland, to the estate where he'd worked before the war. to a job that no longer existed because the laird's family was gone, and the land had been sold to pay death duties. December 1918. 1 month after the armistice, Ridgway received an unmarked package containing a weapon he recognized instantly, the P-14 Mach T, his specific rifle, serial number, and wear patterns unmistakable. No letter accompanied it, no explanation, just the rifle and 3 boxes of ammunition. Someone in the War Office had decided he should keep it. A reward, perhaps, or an acknowledgement, or possibly just bureaucratic oversight in the chaos of demobilization. Ridgway took the rifle to the Scottish Highlands to a ridge overlooking the estate where he'd worked, and spent an afternoon considering what to do with it. The weapon represented technical achievement, brilliant engineering, innovative optics, practical applications of physics that gave users genuine advantage in specific conditions. It also represented a form of warfare that had proven too psychologically corrosive to systematize, too effective at creating trauma in both enemy and user. The P-14 Mach T could kill men who believed themselves safe, who never heard the shot that killed them, who died without participating in the mutual exchange of violence that made warfare comprehensible to human psychology. It was murder dressed in military necessity, and the only thing preventing its widespread use was deliberate choice to not manufacture more of them. Ridgway disassembled the rifle methodically, barrel, stock, action, scope, laying components on granite stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. He could keep it as souvenir, as proof of his service, as tangible evidence that the fog ghost had been real, or he could ensure that this particular weapon never killed anyone again. He chose destruction. Not dramatic, no fire or river disposal, just systematic dismantling using rocks and leverage, breaking components into pieces too damaged to repair, scattering them across 10 square miles of highland terrain, where they would rust into landscape and eventually become indistinguishable from the iron-rich soil itself. The Aldi's scope, that brilliant innovation that could see through fog, he kept, not as trophy but as reminder. Technical solutions to human problems are never neutral. They carry moral weight that engineers and users must acknowledge. As twilight fell across the highlands, Ridgway walked back to the village, carrying the scope in his pack, leaving behind the scattered remains of a weapon that had been too good at its job, too effective at transforming weather into weapon, too successful at making war feel less like mutual combat and more like systematic assassination. Thomas Ridgway lived another 43 years, dying in 1961 at age 75 from complications of pneumonia that doctors attributed to prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions during the Great War. He worked various jobs, gamekeeping when he could find it, construction labor when he couldn't, eventually a night watchman position that suited his preference for solitude and silence. He married briefly in 1923, divorced in 1925, had no children, maintained few friendships. Census records describe him as employed and resident, the bureaucratic minimum that confirms existence without suggesting significance. The official record of the P-14 Mach T program remains classified, buried in War Office archives under designations that obscure rather than reveal. The 12 prototype rifles, 11 after Ridgway destroyed his, were eventually destroyed by official order in 1936, not because they were ineffective, but because military analysts concluded that weapons enabling invisible, long-range assassination of command personnel violated unwritten rules about honorable warfare that great powers needed to maintain if future wars were to remain even marginally constrained by civilized norms. This reasoning seems laughable after World War II and everything that followed, but in 1936, people still believed wars could be fought according to rules that limited escalation. The fog ghost entered military folklore as a cautionary tale told to new sniper recruits, the story of a weapon and a man that were too effective, that achieved tactical success while creating strategic problems, that demonstrated the uncomfortable truth that some military advantages cannot be fully exploited, because doing so damages the psychological contract that allows soldiers to function as soldiers rather than as serial killers with government authorization. What made the P-14 Mach T terrifying wasn't its technical capabilities. Nations would soon develop weapons far more devastating, but its psychological precision. It killed specific individuals while leaving witnesses, destroyed command structures while preserving combat formations, created fear disproportionate to casualties, because it violated expectations about visibility, distance, and fair warning. Modern warfare has long since abandoned such constraints. Precision-guided munitions, drone strikes, and satellite targeting have made the fog ghost's advantages seem quaint, but Ridgway's experience remains instructive. Technical capability races ahead of moral philosophy, and soldiers pay the psychological price for society's failure to reconcile effectiveness with ethics. The fog that made Ridgway lethal eventually rolled away, as weather always does. But the internal fog, the moral ambiguity of being exceptional at killing, never fully cleared. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a gamekeeper who learned to hunt men with the same patient, methodical efficiency he'd used for deer, and discovered that some skills, once acquired, cannot be unlearned, only refused.